Yeah, it creates more density.
Okay, hey, let's have one conversation at a time, please. Sir, let's have one conversation at a time. I'll absolutely call on you when it's your turn. Please, go ahead.
I was going to say, is it not an axiom, which is to say it's an inevitable rule that higher density means more affordable, lower density means less affordable?
Absolutely. Supply and demand. The more supply, the lower the prices. Absolutely.
So you don't get a choice to have both.
You do not get to have both. That's right. Nobody's ever gotten both. Except in the declining neighborhood. Detroit got both.
Is it true that rising property values will put pressure on current property owners through rising property taxes?
No. Because Prop 13,
No?
I mean, yes and no. Property taxes can go up 1% a year, which is far less than the rate of depreciation. There were other comments. Yes.
Just to answer your question as to what we would prefer, whether we would prefer a combination of the two best scenarios. One where those who may be priced out but want to stay here could have a space that they could rent, they could buy for that matter. I would favor something that would afford folks who want to stay in the Region Valley the opportunity to stay, whether they be renters or whether they be buyers. It'd be a best case scenario.
We already have a place to rent.
For you, if there was a scenario that would allow preservation of the stock and the affordability, that would be great. I'm not sure how we do that, but I think that is the golden challenge. Yeah.
It might be worth one more workshop on a community land bank. Or there are mechanisms, but they're outside of the zoning laws,
Right.
I think.
No, that's such an important point. And so frequently we turn to the tool, the main planning tool we have is zoning. And it basically can stop people from doing things. That's all it can do. And if what you want to do is preserve housing, what you really need is money and an organization and the will to do it. And zoning's not going to get you that. Yeah.
Isn't it true that even if there was, in certain dynamic neighborhoods, that even if you increase density, sometimes you would have to, if the purpose of increasing density was to maintain affordability or to increase affordability, in certain scenarios, wouldn't the community have to put a tremendous amount of pressure on folks, to make sure that that wasn't? I'm just thinking about certain parcels that we're dealing with in this particular neighborhood.
I mean, there are legitimate differences of opinion on that. I think one school says, and this is sort of the San Francisco school, says that you have to fight everybody and you have to make and provide 10 or 20% affordable units for everyone. I disagree with that school, because I think then you get San Francisco. Because what happens is you actually slow development, because everything becomes a fight, and so the supply can't keep up with the demand. And you might get 20 units of affordable housing, but you've lost the war. And so that's again, but there are very smart people who disagree with me about that.
But what are the tools? Let's say some degree of consensus to emerge about increasing density.
Yeah.
What are the tools that a community has available to them to be able to make sure that the purpose for increasing density actually got fulfilled?
Right. Well, okay. So I would argue that you cannot control it. That the only thing to do is what you said. And in fact, this is how a lot of the thinking and the cutting edge of the policy world is going. I think people are recognizing zoning as a failure in terms of getting affordable housing. And the only way to do it is to make it happen. And when we look around the city, the greatest source of affordable housing is all the housing that's there. And the idea that we would somehow tear it all down and replace it with these new buildings that are 80% rich people and 20% low-income people, I think is increasingly being seen as an absurd solution for this massive affordability crisis. And again, this meeting, if you're today, to invite anybody who wants to disagree with that.
As a different opinion, Tomat, there is a plan in Chinatown, it's called the Cornfield Rural Central Specific Plan. And their goal was to allow density to increase in certain areas, incentivizing affordable housing. It sounds great policy-wise, and we're still waiting to see if that actually encourages affordable housing to be built. So I would say that's one of the examples that planning has tried. I don't know, Craig, if you have any follow-up to that.
Well, those are almost all vacant lots, so it's a really unique context. And we have, and actually there are no projects right now, so.
Yeah, and I should say, just to complete the thought, that what I think people are realizing, Steve, is that if we do something to take the de facto affordable housing that's already there on the marketplace and find ways to preserve it by buying affordability covenants from the current landlords, that sort of thing, we might get a lot more bang for our buck as far as actually doing what we're trying to do, which is to keep the community in place. Again, that's yeah.
So I wanted to point out one thing too, that under all circumstances, there will be increased density. So for instance, the existing properties that we're talking about in the CM zone have been used for jobs and industry in the past. The urgency here is that we're seeing a transition from that to a pressure to convert that entirely to housing. So just to say, at least one group of people in the community, the neighborhood council and its folks, came to the opinion that focusing on a balance between commercial use, which provides jobs that people can literally walk or bike to, along with increasing some of the inevitable residential development made sense. The other point on the density of how much you can build, the floor area ratio everybody's been talking about, is that if we take all the CM zone, we divide it up to how many units you could make, it would be some 1,400 units if we just wiped everything clear. At a 0.75 FAR, we end up with an average unit size of 900 square feet, a lot like our bungalows. At 1.5, we end up with an average unit size of 1,800 square feet. Quite a disparity between the existing community.
And how do you get that unit count?
Oh, well, you take the amount of units can be built by the area of the buildable lot, which is 1,200 square feet per unit, and then you take the amount of area that, the 0.75, that is 3/4 of a lot could be built in one scenario, and 3/4 of a lot, or 1.5 times a lot could be built in another. So it's a little bit of complicated math. But I think the end result is to look at that. There's a lot of different implications. The other thing I want to say is this scenario about looking at existing stock is very important to talk about. Many people in this neighborhood already have hidden density. In other words, we have lots of people living in garages. We have very restrictive setback requirements on residential land. What about giving relief to those setback requirements so people that are illegally using their land in a particular way that benefits them now would be able to convert that into a legal use, and thereby we keep that within the community and incentivize other forms of housing that can be very adaptive.
Now, I don't want to put Craig on the spot, but I should say that I actually think that is something you might be able to do to some degree with preconditions, is to find a way to sort of formalize some of the informal stuff that's already out there.
In other words, people that are here already might be able to benefit and continue more easily because they could use what they're already doing.
And I know there are other programs in the city to formalize informal units, like when an apartment owner illegally converts the gym in the building to 2 units and they get found out, they can keep those as housing as long as they record an affordability covenant. So there might be things like that. Do you want to talk about it, or should you just want to listen right now?
I think that's an interesting point. However, what we're looking at are the queue conditions on the industrial land versus the residential neighborhood. That's a much larger.
Yeah, I was just trying to point out that there may be some mechanisms to empower existing residential landowners, and that we got to look at the balance of what this would do relative to the existing.
That's a very constructive.
And those efforts would be outside of this queue condition, or separate from?
And it's because, I guess, as we're saying, this effort is not for residential.
Right.
I was going to say, to back up what Steve was saying and put it back in the context of the queue condition properties. Steve was parsing some really good information there, and he was referring to the existing queue condition. So the factors he was using, the 1,200 square feet, is a component of the existing queue condition that also allows for an FAR of 1.5. So what Steve said was, as is, the number of units that are potentially buildable on the CM zone is 1,400, and the average unit size would be
1,800. If people ask that.
And so that's I think the fundamental question. It's the first board. Do we want to consider no change to the queue condition? And if so, that's the result.
Or at least that is one. That is the theoretical result. Again, as a developer, I can say that what I usually do is I'll look at the product type that's going to sell. If it's a 900 square foot then that's what I'll build, even if I could build an 1,800 square foot. If it's an 1,800 square foot, that's what I'll build, even if I don't have to. So I don't know that it's fair to, again, to assume that, again.
As a developer too, you would also, consider, can I increase that with the bonus density? So that it actually exceeds what Steve said, so there's quite a bit more to it. So I think that the fundamental question here is, are people interested in just leaving the Q condition alone? Or, what are the spectrum of alternatives? We've got at least 2 others over here, and I'd love to hear some point of conversation about it.
Okay.
She was raising her hand for a while.
I was just wondering, how's this going to affect safety? It seems like a lot of people are talking about large developers that are coming in on the large properties and building housing developments. But what about small properties that are in that area that are trying to open something smaller, like a coffee shop or a bike shop, a cafe?
Okay, so this, I guess, I don't know, Helen, would you consider this part of the encouraged adaptive reuse question?
Yes, part of the encouraging adaptive reuse is keeping buildings like this. This used to have a different use, and now it's being used as a community services center that's a continuation high school. Under the encourage adaptive reuse, we want to encourage buildings like this that are still in good condition to exist, but then to also allow the use within here to be more commercial manufacturing to kind of keep in spirit of the nature of the buildings and allow for live work where there's a combination of both. So we did actually put in that scenario allowing for retail and cafe uses in small retail.
So just to carry it home, the reason why buildings like this often get torn down, there are 2 reasons. One is there's an overwhelmingly more valuable thing to do with the property. Like, in theory, the vacant lots in the cornfield would actually turn out not to be overwhelmingly more valuable as buildings under the rules of the cornfield. But, a vacant lot, a building's generally worth more than a vacant lot. In a situation like this, I know, and I'm sure you guys know, and anybody here, you know, you're always thinking, if I just kept the envelope, you guys, for sure, if I kept the envelope of the building, and I could really do something good with it, it's better to keep what I got than it is to tear it down and start fresh with this whole new thing. And so often the reason why developers will choose to tear it down is because when you change the use to something new, you have to comply with all these new zoning rules that just aren't practical, like all these parking spaces and all this other stuff. You just can't do it unless you tear it down. And so I think part of the idea here is to provide relief on parking requirements and other things to make it more viable to keep and reuse these existing buildings versus to change the use. Yeah.
So let's assume that you are encouraging adaptive reuse. What does this say about vacant lots?
That's a great question. I think this is actually, this one is silent on that one. But,
Except that it's lower,
except the one.
Yeah, the 2 ways that we thought about creating these scenarios was to get people thinking about 2 kind of questions that have been unclear and also contentious. One is, what is the type of use you want to see in buildings like this, or also in just existing commercial, industrial land that could be changed to anything? Do you want it to be more commercial, more manufacturing, more residential? And that's something that hasn't been kind of fully clear what people want, the community wants. And then the second is the physical shape of these buildings is something that the community members you guys have all expressed is scary, is contentious, and there are 2 ways that you can shape that, is by changing how high the building is. Currently what's allowed is 45 feet. Do we want to keep it at 45 feet? Do we want to go lower? The other thing is floor area ratio, which is a very wonky zoning term. It really is how big the massing of your building is, the size of your building, how many floors and how much space each square footage each floor has. And so those are the 2 things that could be changed: the size of the building in terms of floor area ratio and the height of the building. And if you can't change both, like you could, if you were to pick which one's more important, which one is more important? That's why we created these scenarios that say that for housing, we're actually going to lower the height but keep the size of the building. And for places that are more adaptive reuse or more commercial, we're going to leave the height as is but limit the size of the buildings. And that was arbitrary. It's just something we want to throw out there to see how you guys would respond, because there hasn't been a real clear consensus on, if push comes to shove, which are your priorities.
Right, and again, there are 2 reasons to limit the height and the massing of the building. One reason is because you actually don't want big buildings in the neighborhood. That's one reason to do it. The other reason to do it is, let's say this were downtown LA, And you could put a 50-story building here and it would sell. If you could do that, then it doesn't matter how easy it is to put a cafe in here, because you do a 50-story building and sell it and get out under most circumstances. Some owners wouldn't do it. Anyway, so if you limit the massing of the building that's allowed under zoning, notwithstanding the fact that we can still go and apply for a new zone and all that other stuff, presumably it becomes less appealing to tear it down. And so the second reason to limit the massing isn't because you necessarily want buildings that are small, it's because you don't want there to be a much better option economically than what you got right now. Yeah.
I also think it would encourage people, maybe people in the neighborhood or nearby who would like to open a business who couldn't open a 50-story building because they don't have the income for that.
Right.
Which is, yeah, I support that.
Right, cool, okay, thank you. Yeah, Dave.
I would support reducing the height as opposed to allowing it and to retain the height that it's present. The other thing that I wonder if this exercise is missing is piggybacking with what Steve was saying, the opportunity to incorporate the residential element into the Q conditions. Because I see this dynamic unfolding where we see business, commercial, and inevitably the residents are impacted. What if there's an opportunity here where residents can also be winners in building and creating sources of income for themselves, where presently they're only limited to a single residence. And also, to Steve's point, for those who are here who want an opportunity to participate in the wealth of a business, in the joys or tears of a business, but can't afford, what affordable mechanisms are being explored to allow for those opportunities to present themselves? Banking, I know we've talked about in some of our workshops, enticing banking, lending institutions to come in and partake in this